It is my great pleasure to introduce to you all Jack Liang. He is the Chief Financial Officer for Washington County, and I believe Patrona will be running his slides. And with that, I would like to welcome Jack.
Thank you, Christina. So I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for the time allotted to me to provide to the civic leaders and program overview and a budget development overview for Washington County. It is definitely one of the more important processes at the county, as the budget document and the budget policy that's adopted by the board is very much so a priority setting exercise that the county goes through and to set county operational priorities. So with that, today we're going to go over some of those details. And if we can roll to the next slide, please. And for a quick self-introduction, my name is Jack Liang, and I am a licensed CPA in the state of Oregon. And currently, I'm serving as the Interim Chief Financial Officer for Washington County. I have been with the regular Chief Financial Officer for the last 3 years, and I belong to the Department of Finance. Oh, sorry, one more back. Belong to the Department of Finance, and the telephone number and the email address that's listed over here is the telephone number for the Finance Department and the email address for the budget team that's within Washington County. So if you have any questions after today's session, please feel free to reach out to this number and that email address, and a team member will be able to answer your questions. Next slide, please. So the county budget basics, and today we're going to go over some of this budget basics, including the budget guidance, is where do we receive the guidance from, the type of funds, which is a technical term that we use in the budget, and the operational areas that's within the county budget, as well as how the budget is developed, what that process looks like. And we're going to use the fiscal year 2021-22 budget overview. If you're not used to the fiscal year notion where we include 2 years in that, the 2021-22, what that means is the county's fiscal year actually does not start in January and then end in December. The county's fiscal year actually starts in July of 2021, and it ends in June 2022. And that is why we use a 2-year notion to mark the fiscal year, which is fiscal year 2021-22. So the Washington County's mission, it's worth mentioning over here, is to provide excellent and cost-effective services that support healthy, peaceful, safe, and sustainable communities, and encourage meaningful participation in community activities and county governance. Next slide. So next slide, this is where we delve into the guidance and the funds part. The guidance, first of all, let's start with a higher level guidance. Where we receive guidance on the county's budget is actually Oregon law. In Oregon, many of the law is codified into Oregon revised statute. And for budget specifically, it falls under Oregon revised statute, ORS 294.305 through 294.565. So within that portion of the statute, there's very, very strict rules about how a local government is supposed to conduct. It includes all of the requirements about the public process, about a budget committee being formed, as well as the formal adoption of the budget. So if you're interested in what the law speaks to, definitely Google ORS 294.305. That's where all the budget regulation and rules that we have. And then in addition to that, we also have the county charter and codes that speaks to the county's financial management and budget. And that is actually where a 5-year forecast of the county's financial condition is required. And then last but not least, we have the Board of County Commissioners' directions and priorities. So this obviously are priorities and directions that's presented to the county's management by the board. But in addition to that, the board navigates the community's interest and the community's priorities on a regular basis. And they actually use those community priorities to formulate a direction and a priority for the board to communicate to the budget. And next, we're going to speak to the funds, which is a technical term that we use in the budget. So the funds are like a separate account or a checkbook where we segregate different money that's within the county's budget. You can consider a fund is basically like a segregation of your checking account where you use that to facilitate your operational cash, and then a savings account where our reserves might be put into. So I found this is actually a legal segregation of the county's resources and expenditures. Once we adopt budget, once it's in a fund, we cannot move things between funds without specific actions. And then these funds, where the county has a lot, can be categorized as either the general fund or the special funds. The general fund is only one, as you can see, that is a singular term. And then special funds, the county has many, which is a plural term. And if we can go to the next slide, I think we have a little. To really emphasize on that. That's basically where our property tax comes in, the transient lodging tax, a lot of the license and fees that we collect over the counter. So those are the resources that the county has a little more discretion, has a little more decision power on what to spend it on. And on the contrary, we have the special funds, which are usually money that we receive from other sources or from a very dedicated specific resources, and that are either by law or by where we're receiving the funds from are required to spend it a certain way. And oftentimes these resources come in the form of grant, where there are very specific requirements what this grant is for, or it comes in the way like the state gas tax, for example, and then has very specific requirement to spend that amount of money on road services. So those are special funds that are used to segregate the dedicated resources and associated expenditures to a very, very special purpose. And the county oftentimes has very little discretion over how to spend that money. Next slide, please. So for you to get an overview of what's general fund and what's special fund, in this chart, we list out the services that are covered under general fund on the left-hand side. And then what are some of the services that are covered under special funds on the right-hand side? For example, like the animal services, the assessment and taxation, the Board of County Commissioners, County Administrative Office, also to the Sheriff's Office, District Attorney, Justice Court, Juvenile, and the long-range planning portion of the land use. So those are all examples of a general fund. They are traditionally supported by property tax money. They're traditionally supported by the over-the-counter license and fees that we collect. On the special fund side, we have community corrections, community development, disability and aging services, and all of that has a very, very special and dedicated revenue source that come into those funds. For example, the community corrections, we actually receive a great portion of the funding from the state, specifically for community correction. What that means is once we receive that money, we have zero discretion on spending that on anything other than community corrections. And the same thing goes for the community development, same thing goes for all these other things that goes under special funds. Next slide, please. So to understand the budget structure, besides a fund where we keep the money separated, it's very important for you to understand that we actually categorize different things into functional areas. And that really speaks to the operational category of the county's business operations and community services. And on the operating side, we have 5 different functional areas. From left to right, we have general government, we have public safety and justice, we have land use and transportation, we have housing, health, and human services, and we have culture, education, and recreation. It's important to recognize these categories because that's how the county's budget document is built on. So if you're trying to understand it, the county's budget document is almost like a tree from a higher level to more detailed level into each program. This is the second level from the county's total budget. It actually breaks down into the functional area. So this is the second level of breakdown. And then you can see that within each functional area, we have different services that breaks down into another level that's called the organization unit. And then within each organization unit, we have further breakdown into different programs. So general government obviously covers a lot of the general government services, assessment, taxation, county council, support services, all of the internal support. And then public safety covers your sheriff's office, DA's office, community corrections, justice court. Land use and transportation is land use and transportation. And then we have housing, health, and human services, pretty much self-explanatory, as well as culture, education, and recreation. Next slide, please. In addition to the operating functional areas, we also have this other quote-unquote non-operating functional areas, and this includes the county's capital spending, which is not a day-to-day operation kind of need, but it's more of a cyclical capital spending. And we have three categories under that. We have the transportation capital, we have the facilities capital, and then the information technology capital. In addition to that, we also have the non-operating, which is primarily the insurance funds for the county, or the debt service funds for the county, or any other non-operating funds that we have. And then we have non-departmental, which is for the most part the contingency fund within the county. Next slide, please. Now let's talk a little bit about the budget development process. This is a process that actually expands through the whole year for next year's budget. You can see that we actually start our preparation and planning from the first fiscal quarter of the year, July to September. And using this year's example, July to September 2021, we are actually doing the preparation and planning. And then into the October to December, this is pretty much the time around right now. We have the priority setting process, the budget development begins. So this is where the board really navigates with the community. Well, I should really say the board navigates with the community year round on community priorities. But this is a time where that body of work is hot and heavy, where you actually have a budget town hall that's coming up in December, where the board will communicate with the community. And that's one of many forms of how our board of commissioners engage with the community, understand the community's need and interest, and then formulate their budget priorities for this new year. Going into January to March of 2022, that's where budget development and review really gets hot and heavy. That's where the departments do their work to put each program's budget together, and then put each org unit's budget together and submit to my office for review and approval. And then my office actually consolidated all of that into this one budget document, and then bring that to county administrative office for final review. So during that time, it's all of that communication, that internal work that happens. And then come April of 2022, that's where the proposed budget gets finalized. So all of the department has done their work, and then my office has done their work of reviewing everything. It gets assembled into this one big book that's called the proposed budget. And then that gets finalized, and that gets sent to the budget committee of the county, and the budget committee reviews that book. And then at that same time, we're going to schedule all of the public budget meetings. So if you're an engaged community member, you will see a lot of communication coming out of the county, advertising about our budget adoption, about our budget committee meetings. And then going into May 2022, that's where all of the public budget meetings are happening. These are the budget committee meetings, where the budget committee, which is made up by 5 of our board of commissioners plus 5 community members, that come together to form a 10-person budget committee to really review the budget, ask questions, understand if the priorities were carried out in the budget according to the set priorities by the board, and then approve the budget, which is also a very specific legally required step for the budget committee to approve the budget before it goes to the board for adoption. So once the budget committee reviews the budget, everything checks out, and then they approve the budget, it goes into June of 2022. That is where our board formally adopts the budget into law, and then July 1st, that's when the budget goes into operation. So that is the budget development process. Next slide, please. So we're going to use, for you to understand the county's budget, we're going to use fiscal year 21-22 budget as an overview. So we're going to walk through some of the numbers, some of the percentage breakdowns, and try to go into a little more detail about what's behind those numbers. Next slide, please. So first of all, before we dive into the numbers, it's worth mentioning that the county has oh, sorry, my eyes just got a little watery, so allow me to wipe it just a little bit. My apologies for the interruption. Must have gotten a little dust in my eyes. Ooh. Sorry about that. So for the fiscal year 2021-22, the major themes is listed on this slide over here. And this is a major theme that our county administrative office interpreted from the Board of Commissioners and then laid it out into the budget. Essentially, it's another way of saying what's our budget priority for this year. And then the, sorry, my eyes is still bothering me. I'm gonna turn my video off and really dry it real quick.
Yeah, don't worry, Jack. Take your time. Also, as we continue with the presentation, and if we have questions, feel free to put them on the chat or write them on a piece of paper if you are able to. So yeah, so that you don't forget. But I believe we might be taking questions, or we are taking questions towards the end of the presentation.
Okay, I'm back. Let's try this again. So fiscal year 21-22 major themes. These are the major themes that our county administrative office interprets from the board and based on the board's priority setting, and then lay out a major themes for the entire budget document. For fiscal year 21-22, we have these 7 themes that's laid out as the county priorities. Pandemic response, obviously, equity, diversity, and inclusion, housing affordability, economic development, transportation, public safety, as well as capital investments supporting the county systems. So those are the 7 priorities that the county has set and that are reflected in the county's budget investment. That's not to say anything else doesn't get any investment. These are just the areas where we have invested a little more of the discretionary fundings to address some of the ongoing issues. Next slide, please. And then we will start with the total budget. As I was explaining, as we have different layers and different levels of details within the budget, the total budget is at the highest level, obviously. It's the whole county's budget combined together. And the total budget size for this last fiscal year is $1.4 billion in total. And that we have a breakdown of that percentage on the left-hand side, which speaks to the revenue side. And then on the right-hand side, we have a breakdown in percentage on the expenditure side. So look at the revenue first. The couple bigger part is, we have our beginning fund balance, which are the fund balance that's carrying from one year to the next year. And then we have the taxes, which includes all kinds of taxes, but the majority of that is property taxes at 16% of our revenue. And then the intergovernmental, which are the money that we receive from other governments, whether if it's the federal government or the state government. So that makes up about 22% of our total budget. And the other big parts are the operating transfer in, which are the transfer ins among funds that's within the county, and then charges for services at 11%. The smaller portion are the fines and forfeitures, less than 1%, license and permits at 1%, interdepartmental at 4%, and miscellaneous at 4%. And then looking at the expenditure side, the majority of the county's expenditure rests in 2 areas. And the one area is called personnel services. The other area is called material and services. Now, this is a very, very standard budget language for expenditures. If you go to check out other jurisdictions' budget documents, these are 2 very common terms in the expenditure section. So personnel services obviously speaks to the salaries, the benefits, the wages, everything that's associated with the county employees' costs that carry out those services, that carry out those missions. And then material and services includes both the supplies that we buy or anything that we buy, as well as professional services that we contract out to provide some of those county services. So those are the 2 major categories. And then smaller categories includes the operating transfer out at 15%, contingency at 13%, other at 8%, and the capital outlay and the interdepartmental at 3 and 4% respectively. So that's the county's total mixture of the total budget. If you still recall, earlier we talked about the difference between general fund and special fund. So this is combining everything together, including the general fund and all of the special funds that we receive to make up the total budget. Next slide, please. So another look at the county's total budget of that $1.4 billion. This is obviously a little more detail. You can see in the table at the bottom left part where we actually do have a breakdown between the general fund and special fund. The chart right above it, the pie chart, gives you an idea of how much of that is general fund, how much of that is a combined special funds altogether. So general fund stands at about 24%, and special fund is at 76%. And from a dollar perspective, you can look at the middle column over there. General fund is about $333 million, versus special fund is just a little over $1 billion. And that makes up the county's total $1.4 billion budget. Just a reminder, the $333 million is a little more discretionary on the county side. The $1+ billion, while it sounds like a great number, but we really have a very specific purposes that is already dedicated for those funding. And that's outside of the county's discretionary range. Next slide, please. And then for the general fund budget, if we break down the 333, on the left-hand side is the revenue, right-hand side is expenditures. The revenue primarily is made up by a couple different categories. The larger categories, obviously, taxes is the number one, it's 38%. And then the operating transfer in is 23%. That's another major category. There's a third category that is called MISTIP and WCCLS, and that stands for Major Street Transportation Improvement Program, as well as Washington County Cooperative Library Services. Now, those are two dedicated services that has historically dedicated taxes allocated to those services. And those are the areas where we collect the property tax and then immediately turn around and invest in those areas. That has been in the county's practice for a long history. And then smaller categories includes all of the license and permits, intergovernmental revenue, interfund revenue, fines and forfeitures, charges for services. So those make up the rest of that 100% pie chart. And then on the right-hand side, we have the expenditures. Again, personnel services and material and services are the largest expenditure sections, followed by operating transfers out. So because the general fund is kind of discretionary and the board and the county administrative office actually make decisions on where to invest that. So a good portion of that, actually exactly 29%, gets transferred out to another special fund for different reasons. Sometimes maybe we're not receiving enough money for example, at the fair complex, for example, and then we're investing some money over there. If we're not receiving enough state funding into community corrections, then general fund makes a little bit investment there to keep the services going. And same thing gets dedicated to housing services. General fund has a dedicated transfer to housing services. So not only that we use the general fund resources to support the quote unquote the services that's within the boundary of general fund actually has a little discretionary to supplement some of the special funds that we receive, some of the dedicated funding that we receive to make the service whole. And then besides that, we have the contingency, capital outlay, interdepartmental, and other in much smaller percentage. Again, total budget for general fund is $333,665,593 budgeted for last year. Next slide, please. So if we take a look at the general fund's budget by functional area, if you still recall the functional area breakdown, general fund's major functional area are primarily in the general government, in the public safety and justice, and in the housing and health and human services area. So this is and then the smaller portion is the land use and transportation, culture, education, and recreation, non-departmental. And then we also have a large portion of the non-operating, as mentioned, that covers the county's insurance, it covers the county's debt service, and a number of non-operating nature kind of expenditures. The reason you probably immediately notice to see why there's such a big difference among all of the functional areas. In the perfect world, shouldn't everybody get about equal amount of investment in their services? Now, the difference is the amount of special funds that the county actually receives in those areas. For example, land use and transportation, we get very dedicated road fund and gas tax revenue that comes in. So when you look at the total budget chart, which is a couple of slides ago, the pie chart is actually much more equally distributed among all of the functional areas. General fund, on the other hand, is traditionally used to support the general government, to support the public safety and justice area and the housing, health, and human services area. So that's why those areas are a much bigger portion under general fund. And obviously, if you're interested in understanding the more details on the dollar amount, on the right-hand side, we have a nice little table that actually speaks to how much of that 333 million gets invested in different functional areas, along with their percentages. Next slide, please. And then required by the county code, we actually do a 5-year projection on the fund balance for general fund. This is the fund balance that was presented at adoption. So our board's policy, just for everyone's background, and this is actually a pretty important county policy, is for us to maintain a fund balance of 15% to 20%. And the 15% to 20% is a range. So basically, we're required to maintain it at a minimum of 15, at a maximum of 20. At the time of this budget adoption, our year fiscal year 20-21 has not finished yet. So that's why you're seeing a solid line between the 1920 to 2021, which is actually what happened. And then the dotted lines are our projections going 5 years into the future. And that is something that we navigate every year and trying to utilize a lot of assumptions to project what we're going to end up with. So at the time of the budget adoption, things are looking good. We are seeing a bit of a fund balance spend down, which is on purpose because we were accumulating, the fund balance were accumulating at a high level at 28.45%. So we're making a conscious effort to invest more to get the balance down into compliance. And then we're anticipating to end up with 19.35 and then navigate along the line of 15 to 20% of the fund balance. Next slide, please. And by the way, I noticed that there's a lot of questions that's popping up on the chat. And for the sake of time, I'm trying to get through the presentation, and then we're going to get to the Q&A session if we have time left. So thank you very much for your patience. So this general fund forecast 5-year is more of a current picture that we're seeing. As you can see that the trend has changed. Before, at the budget adoption, we're seeing a dip down of the fund balance, and then it goes up and down, navigating in that 15% range. And then in this chart, while it's still maintaining in that 15 to 20% range, we're seeing a slippage into a downward trend, and that trend is not really coming back up. It has a little sign of coming back up toward the end, but it's not obvious enough. And what's making that difference is in our assumption that we have actually bumped up inflation rate, because at the time of the budget adoption, we have not accounted for a hyperinflation at the time. But then in the last couple of months, I'm sure many of you have read in the news, have heard about the inflation that would be higher than normal. So we have built in part of those rate into the county spending, and that's what is changing the fund balance for the county, fund balance projection for the county. So that's something that we're continuing to navigate and trying to come up with creative solutions to help mitigate in the future years. Next slide, please. So I will quickly go over each one of the functional areas, and just to give you a general breakdown of what gets spent in each one of the functional areas and what kind of services provides in there. Under general government, it's pretty plain and simple. It's your traditional general government. It includes the board, the government office, the county council, county auditors, the elections, assessment, taxation, office of equity, inclusion, and community engagement. And then on the support services side, we have all of the internal support functions, like your finance, your HR, your IT, your facilities, your procurement folks, fleet services. All of that internal support is under support services. So within the functional area of general government, our total budget in that is, well, actually, I didn't do a total between the direct and support services. So it's roughly 200 million over there, with 183 million that's in support services and 26 million that's in direct services. And the breakdown is on the right-hand side. You can see that 21% is direct services. Now, the reason that we have a much higher percentage in support services is because a great portion, nearly half of that, is under COVID-19 response and recovery. And that was categorized under support services. Your regular support is actually about 43% of that total. Next slide, please. Going into public safety and justice, that's where we have a mixture of general fund, local option levy, special funds, and ESPD. Now, keep in mind that the general fund portion of the public safety sector is about 101 million, as you can see in that middle column in the table right there. And then there's a lot of other funding sources that comes in, which are dedicated. And those dedicated funding sources combined with the general fund resources makes up about $218 million worth of public safety and justice. That gets broken down into the bottom table of there. You're seeing community corrections, district attorney, justice court, juvenile services, law library, local option levy admin, and the sheriff's office. So sheriff's office obviously is by far the largest department that's within the county by people, and then it accounts for 62% of the public safety and justice, and the other departments make up the other 38% of the public safety and justice. Next slide, please. And then moving on to land use and transportation. Now, land use and transportation has a total of $117 million budget in fiscal year 21-22. The details are in the top left corner. And then in the top left, in the bottom left, that's where the service areas gets broken down into building services, current planning, long-range planning, other public land corner, road fund, as well as survey area. So all different kind of services that's under land use and transportation. And then by far the largest fund in the land use and transportation area is the road fund, 71% of the total mix, followed by building services at 15%, and the other services make up the entire 100% pie chart. Next slide, please. Next, we have housing, health, and human services. Now, this functional area has a total budget of $250 million that gets broken down into the service levels in the bottom left chart: animal services, community development, HHS admin, housing, human services, as well as public health. You can see that the larger portion are human services at 43%, housing services at 38%, public health at 11%, and the other smaller portions that make up the rest of the chart. Next slide, please. Culture, education, and recreation, which is the fifth of our 5 operating functional area. Total budget size, $64 million, broken down into the fair complex, the libraries, parks, OSU extension, as well as tourism development. And by far the largest budget in this category is actually the library services. As if you recall from a couple of slides earlier, library services actually has dedicated taxes that comes to them, and then they actually have the largest portion in this category at 84%. Fair complex accounts for 9%, and then the other areas accounts for the rest of the percentage pie chart. Next slide, please. So we're moving into the non-operating section of the budget. Starting with the non-departmental, we have the community network, contingency, non-departmental. Total budget size $5 million, very small compared to the other functional areas. So contingency accounts for about 55% of that. And then we have the non-departmental, as well as the community network, which accounts for 24% and 21%. Next slide, please. Facility and technology capital. As previously mentioned, that our capitals are breakdown into transportation as well as facilities and technology. So this chart shows our facilities and technology, which are internal capital, that is primarily breakdown into a couple of major categories. We have the emergency communication system, the wingspan event and conference center, the facilities and parks, and the information technology. Total budget size $48.7 million. That's broken down into the percentage that's on the right-hand side. One thing that I want to point out on the capital budget is that it changes every year. So it doesn't stay very flat, and depending on the capital need on a regular basis, every year it changes a little bit. Next slide, please. Transportation capital, primarily dedicated to MISTIP and other. If you still recall, MISTIP is the other category besides the library service that gets dedicated taxes. So their budget is $123 million. And then the other services, capital services, are $86 million. So the total of that budget is $209 million, with MISTIP being 59% and other being 41%. Next slide, please. And last but not least, we have our non-operating. So as mentioned, our non-operating includes our debt service, insurance service, miscellaneous, as well as the replacement and reserve fund. Total budget is $347 million, 348 if we round up. And then you can see the largest portion is actually under miscellaneous. The miscellaneous includes the lottery fund, the strategic investment program, gain share, general fund transfers, as well as cost allocation. 57% of that. And with the other major categories as the insurance, 19%, debt service, 12%, and replacement and reserve at 12%. So if you want to understand a little more about the miscellaneous category, it's really a mixed bag of a lot of different things. Reach out to me and my team later, and we will be happy to provide a little more context to that. As well as you can read into the budget document where it speaks to that, and each one of those org units has a very detailed description of what it does. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to reinforce and reiterate the difference between general fund and special fund. general fund $333 million budget, if you recall, is primarily the county's discretionary resources. Special fund, on the other hand, is primarily for the county's dedicated resources, where the county has very, very little discretion on how to spend. Hopefully that this resonates with you, and then you can use this knowledge to interact with our board to continue to share about community priorities and community needs. Next slide, please. So I just want to point out our website has a lot more information. We spend a lot of time today, but still with even this much time, it's barely scratching the surface of the county's budget. So if you go to the county's homepage and click on the financial information on the left-hand side, and then that will get you to a link to the county's financial information. So I highly encourage everyone to start, if you're interested, to dig into the county's financial information, and feel free to reach out to my office and ask questions anytime. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to reiterate my appreciation for your time, and hopefully we have some time for questions. And I want to say that the phone number and the email address is listed on this slide is available to you for any questions or ongoing discussions about the county's finances. Please feel free to reach out. Actually, we encourage you to reach out. And with that, I wanted to do a quick time check to see if we have any time for Q&As, or should we take some of the questions and answers offline later?
Thank you, Jack, for the wonderful presentation. As always, very empowering to learn about the budget and how it works. So thank you very much for your willingness to take time out of your busy schedule and to be with us today. So thank you. And I believe we may have probably for one question, and then if we have more people who have questions, we're going to ask you to please put them on the chat, and then we'll make sure to email those questions to Jack to get some answers. But we do have some time for one question, if there's like a question that someone really wants to ask. No questions.
I got a quick question here. It looks like just in your experience, why do you think it's so useful and informative for people to know about the budget process?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. As I was trying to articulate, the budget document is a very important priority setting document for the county, and especially with obviously I keep stressing that there's a huge portion of the budget, like more than 1 billion of the $1.4 billion budget is not discretionary. The county has very little choice on what to spend it on. But then there are discretionary fundings where the county has some good discretion on where to prioritize those funding, where to provide the services that turns into communities' need. So understanding the county's past practice as well as current practice on how to prioritize that resources to community members in terms of interacting with our board of commissioners and navigate those articulate those community needs in a much more systematic way, I should say, and in a much more collaborative kind of sense. Just because knowing some of those background is going to help those conversations be constructive and be productive, rather than starting from scratch without knowing some of those backgrounds. So the budget document is actually, in my own word, it's more or less of a history book for the county. If you can actually read back to maybe even 10 to 20 years of the budget and see how the county has progressed in terms of our spending, in terms of our investment, and that really speaks to a lot of the services that's currently in the ground right now. And I truly think that being somewhat knowledgeable to how the county not only adopt this year's budget, but what kind of journey we have went through to the budget adoption, it's going to make that whole community engagement process much more interactive and much more efficient. And we're here to support that process. So like I said, my team is ready to answer any questions, to help with the community on understanding. We actually thrive on government transparency. There's nothing that we're hiding in the county that cannot be shared with the public. So feel free to reach out and ask questions anytime.
Thank you so much, Jack, again for that wonderful information. And thank you for your time and for your dedication, the leadership that you have within Washington County, and your passion in this particular topic as well. Thank you for joining us.